Drew here, and if someone were to argue after this episode, Servant Season 3, Episode 3, titled Hair, that Servant was spinning its wheels, I would have a hard time arguing with them because this episode doesn't give a lot to defend oneself with. I'm still enjoying the show very much, don't get me wrong. I just feel like this episode kind of exposed some of the weaknesses in the Servant formula. Obviously, these episodes are too short, so when you get an episode like this that you can't immediately start the next episode, I think it becomes a little glaringly more obvious than it would if it was something that you were binging. But this episode, you have it driven plot-wise by Julian.
I was thinking we should test Leanne and Jericho's DNA.
Why the hell would we do that?
Know for sure.
This was a very, very contrived objective for him. I think it's a little bit hard for him to drive storylines because I love Rupert Grint's performance, but I think that he is very much a supporting character in this show. And whenever the show does a Julian-centric episode, I think it's a little bit hard for him to drive the plot. And this just kind of seems like a side plot episode, except it had the potential to explode everything because Julian's quest to find out whether or not Jericho is actually a Turner, I mean, he doesn't view it that way, but that's how the audience views it. And that became clear when he switched objectives midstream.
So, okay, maybe get Dorothy's hair instead? To prove that she's not the mother.
I thought the point was to prove that it's Leanne's kid.
These two quests, when you think about it from Julian's perspective, it doesn't really make sense. I think that the creators of the show wanted to hold out the possibility to the audience that potentially we could learn once and for all if this was Jericho resurrected or if it was some other baby. And there was a rational explanation for everything that we've seen happening. Because this show has always liked to give, a rational explanation and a supernatural explanation for pretty much everything that happens, this would have been quite a development because you wouldn't be able to view this as any other way except supernatural if the child was confirmed to actually be Jericho, or at least to be a child of Dorothy. That would be game-changing. And so, of course, by the end of the episode, it became obvious that the writers never intended to let this happen because they're not ready to confirm one way or the other yet, and they may never be. But this trick is getting a little old. I think that at first it was compelling because you kept wondering, are they at some point going to actually confirm what's happening is supernatural, or are they just going to keep, letting us wonder forever, even though it seems likely that it is supernatural. But the problem with that is that they've done it for so long. We're 2 seasons in and 3 episodes into another season, that it's becoming obvious that they're not going to let that happen, or at least not for a very, very long time, and certainly not in this episode. And the excuse that they came up with for keeping Julian from immediately going back and once more trying to deduce, trying to do another DNA test to try and figure out whether Jericho was Dorothy's child or not. The excuse they came up with for that made it glaringly obvious that this was all writerly tricks and that it didn't really fit naturally into the story.
Julian, never do anything like that again. It was a serious breach of trust.
Yeah, I won't.
He's going to stop because Dorothy asked him to. Now, I think one could possibly infer that the despair he felt when he found out that it wasn't actually Jericho, I think that even he perhaps is wishing deep down to believe that Jericho is back among the Turner family, even though he might come up with rational explanations that it's not true, even though he might try to deny it. So you could argue that at the end of this episode, perhaps he's decided that feeling that he had when he thought he had confirmed that it wasn't actually Jericho, that he doesn't want to have that feeling again, that he would rather just continue in denial. If that's the case, I think they need to do a little bit more to establish that. I think you could infer it potentially if you wanted to, but I don't think it was something that is canon at this point. But you know, this reason for him to stop looking into it, to stop trying to find out the answer, it doesn't really make much sense. Like, you would just stop because Dorothy asked you to, when you knew Dorothy wouldn't want you to in the first place. I highly doubt that would stop him if he really thought it was the right thing to do. And like I said, the fact that he switched objectives from getting DNA to prove that it was Leanne's baby to getting DNA to prove that it wasn't Dorothy's baby midstream kind of shows that this was all for the audience, because either objective would accomplish the same thing for the audience, demonstrating that, wait a second, it probably is baby Jericho resurrected. But now we don't have that confirmation one way or the other. So this whole objective was something that works for the audience, but it doesn't really accomplish anything for Julian from what I can tell. And the fact that it's Vera driving it and that Julian switches objectives just because she suggests that he should kind of makes you think that he didn't have that much invested in this objective in the first place. Now, Vera, played by Sunita Mani, I feel like she's very suspicious. There, you heard it here first. But really, though, the way that she pushes Julian this episode, the way that she kind of comes up with a different objective for him once the first objective falls through, it kind of seems like she could be someone from the cult. You know, I don't know what her ultimate goals were, but it does seem like she's highly manipulative with Julian, and it's just interesting that anyone would put up with the Turner craziness, let's say. Otherwise, this episode, though, you know, we got some very interesting direction from Carlo Mirabella Davis, the director of Swallow. You see at the start of this episode, there's a sequence in which we get to see Julian reacting to the death of Jericho and see him having a very visceral reaction and, you know, vomiting down the staircase on top of the camera. And a very interesting shot. To me, seeing the vomit kind of, and I'm sorry to be disgusting, but you know, you hopefully watch this episode at this point, so hopefully this is less disgusting than actually seeing it. But the vomit actually like pooling on the camera kind of took me out of the moment. Whenever there's a sequence where you can just tell that something is on the camera, like blood during a battle sequence, or you know, anything is actually on the camera glass, I always find that takes me out of the moment a little bit, because I like to think of the way I'm viewing a story as like an all-knowing eye. I like not to think of it as an actual camera with glass that can get smudged or smeared or have stuff spray on it. So to me, that was a little taking me out of it, but it was an interesting shot nonetheless. But you know, I do think it was interesting this episode seeing how baby Jericho's death affected Julian, and you know, seeing the aftermath of that. I thought that Rupert Grint really did a lot to sell the characterization this episode with his performance. Oftentimes, like I said, he's a very good supporting character, but oftentimes he's asked to do nothing more than to be the comic relief and to react to other characters. In this episode, seeing that he's someone who has psychological torment as well, I think it deepens our understanding of the character. You know, otherwise, this episode, it was interesting that Leanne found that hair in her drink, that it showed up in her mouth. It's almost like some kind of warning that she received, and maybe that was what led her to go and hide, you know, just take all the hair and remove it from her brush and everywhere else so that Julian couldn't perform the DNA test. As far as the plot line with the homeless people at the park went, I think that they were trying to have a similar kind of tension to, you know, the people in the Turner's home at the party, where at any moment, any one of these people could be up to no good. They could be a member of the cult. And there was a little bit of that tension there, but it wasn't as strong as it was last episode. I don't know if it was because the directing wasn't as strong, or if it was because simply seeing these things in broad daylight and not in the atmosphere of the Turner's home isn't as frightening. But for whatever the reason, even though these homeless people looked kind of, a little bit on the iffy side, let's say, I felt that there was never as much tension in these sequences as there was last episode. And some of it, I guess, is that it just wasn't from Leanne's perspective this episode. It was Julianne's perspective. And the scenes with Leanne were just kind of scenes with Leanne. They weren't trying to capture her point of view as much. So these scenes ended up being less frightening, let's say. I feel like, going to the park, actually arriving at the park, I kind of wish that more attention had been paid to that in the directing, since it's been so hard for Leanne and the audience to get to leave the house. So to me, I kind of felt like these sequences were a little bit flat this episode. They didn't have the level of tension for me that previous episodes have had with these sorts of sequences. So those are my thoughts on Season 3, Episode 3 of Servant Hair. Let me know what you thought in the comments. Let me know how you completely disagree with me if you do. Let me know if you're still watching this show. I get the feeling that this show is kind of slipping under the radar right now. If you're interested in seeing my upcoming reviews of Servant and other shows, please consider subscribing. And as always, thank you for watching.